Hey everyone, this is the conclusion to the Bolshevik Party in conflict, the left communist opposition in 1918 by Ronald Kowalski. Here we go. At many points in the preceding study, major challenges have been made to the left communist image of themselves as representatives of an alternative democratic socialist alternative to Leninism. That is not to say, however, that their ideas should be dismissed as totally lacking in value. They did possess a certain strength, but of a negative rather than a positive character. Their strength lay in the recognition of the threats to the construction of socialism in Russia posed by the policies that Lenin began to pursue after the revolution. In a sense, the left communists were akin to that other great champion of democratic socialism, Rosa Luxemburg, and that they had a much greater awareness than Lenin of, quote, more or less what socialists must eliminate at the outset, end quote, if the path to socialism was not to become strewn with virtually insurmountable obstacles. It is to the strength of their critique that we should turn first. Their opposition to the, quote, shameful peace of Brest-Litovsk was based not simply on a romantic defense of the principle of proletarian internationalism, but also on arguably realistic fears of its potential dangers for the revolution. Had it endured, it would have spelled the end of any prospect of socialism in Russia, with the country becoming at least a semi-colonial appendage of Imperial Germany and its workers and peasants victims of imperialist exploitation. That such a fate was avoided was no thanks to their advocacy of revolutionary war to ignite a socialist revolution that would sweep across Europe in one mighty wave and so eliminate Deus ex machina, the problems of building socialism in Russia. If carried out, such a policy would arguably have brought the full weight of German military power to bear on Russia to crush the revolution. To their surprise, it was Germany's defeat in the West, for which neither they nor Lenin bore any responsibility, which, quote, saved Soviet Russia from such a fate. Equally, their critique of the domestic policies introduced by Lenin and Lenin's faction in the first half of 1918 also demands serious attention. Let us start with agriculture. In the short term, quote, neutralizing the peasantry was probably the only feasible strategy for the Bolsheviks to pursue when the Bolsheviks took power. Yet the means by which Lenin sought to achieve this objective, essentially by the division of land among the peasants, was to create grave economic and socio-political problems for the regime in the future. As the left communists predicted, land division increased the very numbers and power of a small land-holding peasantry, which proved resistant to the eventual transformation of agriculture along collective socialist lines, and more immediately to Bolshevik policies which threatened to strip it of the fruits of its newly won land. For example, at the end of the Civil War, much of the peasantry, with the defeat of the whites now secure in the gains that it had made during the revolution, rose in opposition to Bolshevik requisitioning of grain and forced the party to, quote, retreat again. The new economic policy, quote, the peasant Brest-Litovsk, end quote, was introduced in 1921 essentially to, quote, neutralize, end quote, peasant opposition again and ensure the survival of the communist regime. Yet this too proved to be a temporary palliative. Only 6 years later, the regime was again threatened by the peasantry's unwillingness to market sufficient grain, an unwillingness in large measure caused by the prevailing pricing policy of the government and compounded by uncertainty about the future. On this occasion, the crisis was resolved by brute force, with the dominant Stalinist faction coercing the peasants into collectivization at a staggering cost in human life, and in the long term at the expense of agrarian productivity. The fears of the left communists in large part appear to have been vindicated. Moreover, the left communists foreboding that the recrudescence of authoritarian bureaucratic practices in the administration of industry and the state encouraged by Lenin's policies could only lead to the degeneration of the revolution from the democratic, egalitarian, and collectivist goals of socialism were equally well founded. More than Lenin, the left communists were conscious of the fact that ends and means were inextricably interrelated. In particular, the left communists perceived that a vital element in the construction of socialist society was mass participation in economic and political administration. Otherwise, how could the workers begin to learn these vital arts and liberate themselves from the tutelage of the workers' old masters and the ideology of the old order? If the workers failed to do so, then traditional forms of domination would revive. Indeed, in criticizing Lenin's call for the reintroduction of one-person management in the spring of 1918, Evgeny Preobrazhensky developed his strand in their thinking to its logical and uncannily prescient conclusion. Echoing Leon Trotsky's earlier diatribe against the potential for dictatorship in Lenin's theory of class consciousness and his concept of party organization based upon it, Preobrazhensky prophetically warned, quote, "The party apparently will soon have to decide the question as to what degree the dictatorship of individuals be extended from the railroads and other branches of the economy to the Russian Communist Party," end quote. Preobrazhensky. In the 1930s, the vast majority of former left communists were to fall victim to this party dictator, Joseph Stalin. The acuity of their critique remains striking. Yet when we turn to examine the left communists' own prescriptions, serious misgivings begin to arise. No doubt the left communists attempted to construct the left communists' own program for the transition to socialism, but whether it was the, quote, relatively coherent and articulate alternative to Lenin's that Siriani suggests is open to question. Of course, they were operating in something of a vacuum. Their mentors, Marx and Engels themselves, offered little specific and unequivocal guidance on this matter. As Rosa Luxemburg once remarked, no, quote, ready-made prescriptions, end quote, for building a socialist society existed. In common with most socialists before 1917, the Bolsheviks had given little thought to elaborating a blueprint for the construction of socialism. Reviewing Alexander Bogdanov's Questions of Socialism in the spring of 1918, Bukharin conceded that no such plan existed. It should be formulated only, quote, in the very process of the revolutionary struggle of the proletariat. It itself depends on the changing conditions of this struggle and can be worked out in detail only after the victory of the working class on a global scale, end quote. Bukharin. Perhaps we should credit them for their efforts to provide some content to this lacuna in Marxist thinking, but whatever credit they are given must be qualified where the hell am I? Fuck, lost my spot. But whatever credit they are given must be qualified in light of their failure to articulate a path to socialism which would in fact have devolved power to the workers. At the root of their failure lay the fact that their conception of socialism remained constrained by a series of assumptions which inevitably precluded the realization of this goal. In a rather incoherent way, the left communists arguably enunciated the desires of many ordinary workers who sought control over their own lives. As Rudolf Barrow has argued, they, quote, expressed in some way or other the disillusion of those strata of the workers who saw themselves robbed of their birthright, a disillusion which was by no means focused simply on the particular problem of supply, but was ultimately related to the renewed subaltern role that the majority of workers had in society, end quote. Rudolf Barrow. Yet the proposals to transfer power into the hands of the workers founded on a shibboleth of Marxism at that time, that socialism demanded the abolition of the market and the market's replacement by centrally planned economy. They did not comprehend that their conception of central planning was incompatible with the devolution of authority to the shop floor, and they aspired to. Their failure perhaps was unsurprising. After all, they were pioneers, the first in practice to engage in experiments in the construction of socialism with no historical experiences to alert them to deficiencies in their theory. I would say that's probably a central thesis of this book, is that planning is inherently anti-democratic and authoritarian, which I disagree with I disagree with strongly, but carrying on. Equally, their solution to the problem of burgeoning bureaucratic authority evident in the infant Soviet Republic was fatally flawed by their conceptions of socialist politics. As much as Lenin, they saw politics per se as the sphere of conflicts between classes. As such, it would become redundant in socialist society, where it would be replaced by the, quote, administration of things, end quote. Hence, they shied away from contemplating the creation of an institutional nexus, both to mediate any disputes that might arise and to check the untrammeled power of the bureaucracy. Instead, they sought the solution to bureaucratic abuse in what Thomas Remington has described as, quote, class purity in the composition of the state, end quote. Thomas Remington. In other words, the workers are to be promoted to run all administrative organs, yet their idealization of the capacities and consciousness of the workers to do so proved to be a chimera, as they soon perceived. Then they looked to the most advanced elements of the proletariat, supposedly represented by the party. But even the party in their eyes had become insufficiently pure to solve the problem of bureaucratism. Their solution was to purge it of its non-proletarian or weary and declassed members, whereafter all would be well. In fact, what this meant was the elimination from all positions of power of those who thought or acted contrary to their particular prescriptions of how they should behave. Ironically, the victims of the first of many such purges in May 1918 were the left communists themselves, soon to be followed by the various left factions after the 10th Party Congress in 1921, and ultimately and more violently all real potential or imagined oppositionists in the time of Stalin. Even worse was their attitude to the peasantry. Even had world revolution occurred, the problem of how to deal with the peasantry in Russia, the overwhelming majority of the population, would have remained. But for the left communists, as for the majority of Russian Marxists, the peasants were a cancer, corruptive of socialism. Their objective was to transfer them from petty proprietors into rural proletarians working in large collective farms. But what was to be done should the peasants oppose the fate that the left communists ascribed to them? Implicitly in their program was the idea that force, if necessary, would have to be used to achieve this end. Here, most clearly of all, the anti-democratic character of left communism becomes apparent. In all, Ernest Haberkern's savage critique of another alleged prophet of democratic socialism, Jan Mahaisky, seems to be equally germane to the left communists. Beneath their radical democratic facade, quote, the authoritarian nature of their politics is tended to remain hidden, end quote. I don't know if that's Haberkern or not. And yet the legacy of the left communists endured in Soviet Russia and even beyond. Their fate at Lenin's hands in the late spring of 1918 and even the subsequent victory of the Bolsheviks over their opponents in the Civil War did not resolve the questions that they had asked of the nature of development in post-revolutionary Russia. Survival in power was one thing, but not necessarily synonymous with the creation of a socialist society. Soon other factions emerged, the democratic centralists, the military opposition, and the workers' opposition, to raise again the criticisms of the left communists that the revolution was degenerating from its libertarian goals. Pragmatism and compromises may have contributed to Bolshevik success in retaining power, but had not assured many in the party that all was for the best in the best of all possible socialist worlds. However, the proper study of these oppositions is the subject of another book in itself. Finally, since history arguably is present politics, and the Russian Revolution remains perhaps the most politically contentious subject of the 20th century, what lessons, if any, can be drawn from this investigation? For those studying the revolutions in the hope of finding in left communism a model for democratic socialism that was prevented from coming to fruition either by the exigencies of the Civil War, isolation, or economic backwardness, the prospects are indeed gloomy. Even had the left communists triumphed in 1918, even had Russia been spared the horrors of civil war and mirabile dictu, I don't know what that means, even had the workers of the world come to its aid, it remains doubtful if socialism with a human face would have flourished. The ideological preconceptions of the left communists would have spawned a centralized bureaucratic system, not an emancipated society in which power was diffused to the workers. But there are more fruitful lessons to be drawn. Just as the left communists had some appreciation of what socialists must avoid lest their goals be perverted, so too their failures can alert us to the shibboleths to be destroyed if there is to be any prospect of winning the battle for socialism and democracy, for indeed they are inextricably linked, as Siriani has argued, in the future. Perhaps Mikhail Gorbachev and other advocates of perestroika have recognized this fact, but at the time of writing it remains uncertain how far or how fast the Soviet Union, in fact, will evolve in the direction of a democratic market socialist society. Well, it certainly devolved into a market society, but it certainly didn't devolve into a democratic market socialist society, if that's possible. But anyway, that's the last sentence of the book and the chapter. So thank you so much for listening.